Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a city that was once busy, loud, wealthy, and probably full of merchants arguing over grain prices, and that is now sitting very quietly at the bottom of the Mediterranean. So dim the lights a little. Maybe lower the brightness on your screen. Get comfortable. Because tonight we're drifting back about 2,500 years to the northern coast of Egypt, where a great port city once stood proudly at the edge of the Nile Delta. A place the Greeks called Heracleion, and the Egyptians called Thonis. Yes, two names. Because of course ancient civilizations loved doing that. Why keep things simple? Today we usually combine the two and call it Thonis-Heracleion, which sounds dramatic, mysterious, and slightly like a fantasy novel location. But for centuries, people weren't even sure it had existed at all. It had simply vanished. And for a very long time, historians quietly suspected it might just be one of those half-mythical places ancient writers like to mention while casually exaggerating everything. Because ancient historians, bless them, were not always the most reliable travel bloggers. But we'll get to that. For now, imagine the northern edge of the Nile Delta around 600 BCE. The Mediterranean waves rolling in gently. Flat wetlands stretching inland. Ships arriving from across the ancient world. And sitting there, right at the gateway into Egypt, was Thonis-Heracleion. A city that functioned as the main port of entry into the country. If you wanted to trade with Egypt, this was where you stopped first. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of customs control, but with more temples and fewer board security officers. Ships from Greece arrived here constantly. Also traders from Phoenicia, from Cyprus, and from all over the eastern Mediterranean. They brought wine, olive oil, silver, fine pottery, and in return they left with Egyptian grain, papyrus, gold, and various luxury goods that made Mediterranean merchants very happy. Because Egypt, as usual, was rich, extremely rich, which meant Thonis-Heracleion quickly became a busy, prosperous port city. And not a small one either. The place was full of docks, canals, warehouses, temples, and markets. Boats moved through narrow waterways inside the city itself. Some neighborhoods were basically built on islands connected by bridges, which sounds charming and picturesque, but also, in hindsight, slightly concerning. Building a large city on soft delta mud next to the sea is not always the most stable long-term strategy. But hey, urban planning in the ancient world was often more about vibes than geology. The city was also deeply religious. This was Egypt after all. And the biggest temple in Thonis-Heracleion was dedicated to Ammonius. Now, Ammonius was one of the most important gods in Egyptian religion. Huge temples across the country honored him, especially in places like Karnak Temple. But Thonis-Heracleion had its own massive sanctuary. Pilgrims arrived by boat. Priests conducted elaborate ceremonies. Statues of the gods stood towering over courtyards. Incense smoke drifted through the air. And somewhere nearby, merchants were almost certainly arguing loudly about the price of fish. Because commerce never sleeps. Even in sacred cities. Now the Greeks who visited the place gave it the name Heracleion. Why? Because they believed the legendary hero Heracles had once visited the city. And when Greeks think a hero stopped somewhere, they tend to name things after him. Restaurants, cities, entire regions sometimes. Apparently Heracles had a busy travel schedule. Greek writers later described the city in their histories. One of them was Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is often called the father of history. He is also sometimes called very politely, the father of creative storytelling. Because while he did record many real events, he also included things like giant ants that mined gold. So historians tend to read him with cautious optimism. Still, Herodotus mentioned Heracleion as a real place. He wrote about temples there, and religious ceremonies. He even mentioned a story involving Paris and Helen stopping there before the whole Trojan War situation got dramatically out of hand. Which, if true, would mean Thonis-Heracleion briefly hosted one of the most awkward couples in Greek mythology. Imagine the hotel staff. Welcome to the city. Are you two married? Technically, no. Wonderful. This will definitely not start a massive war. But mythological tourism aside, the city continued thriving for centuries. Huge stone statues were erected. Massive temples expanded, and trade flowed constantly through its ports. Ships sailed down branches of the Nile toward cities like Memphis. Officials inspected cargo. Taxes were collected. Priests performed rituals. Life moved along. Slowly, predictably, the way big cities tend to do, and then over time things started going wrong. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly, because the Nile Delta is built from layers of mud and sand deposited over thousands of years, which means the ground underneath cities like Thonis-Heracleion was, let's say, not particularly solid. Soft sediment, water-saturated soil, and when heavy buildings sit on top of that for centuries, well, nature eventually files a complaint. There were also earthquakes in the region. Nothing Hollywood-level dramatic, but enough to weaken the ground. And when saturated soil gets shaken, it can do something geologists call liquefaction, which is exactly what it sounds like. The ground basically stops behaving like solid ground and starts behaving more like thick soup. And cities, unfortunately, do not perform well when their foundations turn into soup. Buildings tilt, walls crack, structures collapse. The land slowly sinks. And that appears to be exactly what happened to Thonis-Heracleion. Bit by bit, over generations, parts of the city slid downward. Sections collapsed into nearby waterways. Floodwaters crept further inland. Temples weakened. Harbors changed shape. And, eventually, large portions of the city simply disappeared beneath the Mediterranean. Not overnight. Not with a dramatic final explosion. Just gradually sinking. Quietly. Like a city deciding it had had enough of human activity and would prefer a very long nap. By around the 8th century CE, the city was gone. Completely submerged. And over time, people forgot about it. Maps no longer showed it. Travelers stopped mentioning it. Historians debated whether the city had even existed. Maybe Herodotus had exaggerated again. Maybe Heracleion was just a myth. Another half-imagined location from ancient literature. For over 1,000 years, the city stayed hidden under about 10 meters of water, covered by sand and sediment. Statues lying on their sides. Temple columns scattered across the seabed. Ships buried in mud. Very peaceful. Very quiet. Probably full of fish that had absolutely no idea they were swimming through the remains of one of Egypt's busiest ancient ports. And the world might have forgotten it forever. Except in the year 2000, a team of underwater archaeologists led by Frank Gaudio went searching along the Egyptian coast. They were investigating ancient trade routes near the city of Alexandria. Using sonar equipment, sub-bottom profiling, and underwater excavation. Basically the archaeological equivalent of very patient treasure hunting. And eventually, they started finding things. Huge stone blocks, statues, temple ruins, anchors, shipwrecks, all resting quietly beneath the water. What they had discovered was the lost city itself. Thonis-Heracleion. Not a myth. Not an exaggeration. Just a real city that had spent the last millennium minding its own business under the sea. And once archaeologists began exploring the site, they realized it was enormous. Temples, harbors, hundreds of artifacts, dozens of ancient ships, colossal statues, still lying where they had fallen. It was like an entire Egyptian city had been frozen in time and gently placed on the ocean floor, which, from an archaeological perspective, is basically the dream scenario. No later construction, no modern cities built on top, just a perfectly preserved ancient port, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. And in the next part, we'll drift slowly through the ruins themselves, past giant statues of gods, sunken temples, and cargo ships that never finished their final voyage. Because Thonis-Heracleion still has a lot of quiet stories left to tell. And luckily, they've been sitting underwater long enough to become very good at whispering them. Part 2. Statues, sunken ships, and a very calm archaeological treasure hunt. Alright, let's drift a little deeper tonight. If you're listening in bed, maybe roll onto the comfortable side of the pillow. Take a slow breath, because we're about to float gently down through the Mediterranean toward the quiet ruins of Thonis-Heracleion. Imagine descending through slightly greenish water, sunlight filtering down in long soft beams. And slowly, the shapes begin to appear. First the sand, then scattered stone blocks, then something much bigger. A massive statue lying peacefully on its side. One of the first things archaeologists noticed when exploring the site was just how big everything was. Ancient Egyptian cities rarely did anything halfway. If they built statues that were, well, extremely noticeable. And Thonis-Heracleion had plenty of them. Divers found enormous statues of gods and rulers resting on the seabed, some over 5 meters tall. One particularly famous statue depicts the god Hapi. Now Hapi was the god associated with the flooding of the Nile, which made him incredibly important, because without the Nile flooding every year, Egyptian agriculture would have been, let's say, extremely disappointing. So Hapi statues were often shown with a round belly, symbolizing abundance and fertility. The statue discovered at Thonis-Heracleion was enormous, and when divers first saw it lying in the sand, covered in marine growth, it must have felt a little surreal, like stumbling across a sleeping giant. Except this giant had been napping underwater for about 1,200 years. Not bad for a long-term relaxation plan. Nearby, archaeologists also found statues of Egyptian pharaohs, including one believed to represent Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Now, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt after the time of Alexander the Great. And they were technically Greek, but they ruled Egypt like traditional pharaohs, which meant temples, statues, ceremonies, and plenty of royal symbolism. Because when you take over one of the most ancient civilizations on Earth, it's usually smart to keep the religious branding consistent. So the statues at Thonis-Heracleion reflect that fascinating cultural mix. Egyptian religious traditions, Greek influence, Mediterranean trade, all blended together in one busy port city. And now, lying quietly underwater. Another discovery that amazed archaeologists was the number of shipwrecks. More than 60 ancient ships have been found in the harbor area alone, which sounds dramatic, but it actually makes sense. This was one of the busiest ports in ancient Egypt. Ships were constantly arriving and departing. And when the ground beneath the city began collapsing, the harbor probably became chaotic. Piers breaking apart, water levels shifting, docked ships tipping or sinking. So many of those vessels simply settled into the mud. And then the sediment did something wonderful for historians. It preserved them. The Nile Delta is rich in clay and silt, which can seal organic materials away from oxygen, meaning wooden ships, ropes, cargo, even baskets sometimes survive, which is pretty incredible. Most ancient ships vanish almost completely over time, but at Thonis-Heracleion, many are still there, buried under layers of mud like forgotten time capsules. Some ships were small riverboats. Others were large seagoing vessels designed for Mediterranean trade. Archaeologists found amphorae, anchors, coins, and trade goods scattered around them. Little pieces of everyday commerce frozen in time. You can almost imagine the final moments. A merchant ship tied to a dock. Cargo stacked neatly on board. A crew expecting to sail again soon. And instead, the harbor floor slowly shifting beneath them. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just gradual sinking. Which, honestly, feels very on-brand for the slow-moving disasters of the ancient world. One particularly interesting discovery was a huge stone stele. A stele is basically a large carved stone slab with inscriptions. Think of it as the ancient Egyptian version of an official government announcement, except carved into several tons of rock. Because paperwork is more impressive when it weighs as much as a small elephant. This stele contained an inscription from Nectanebo I, and it described a tax decree related to trade entering Egypt. Specifically, goods coming through the port of Thonis, which is fascinating because it confirms something historians had long suspected. Thonis-Heracleion was not just a random harbor. It was the main customs checkpoint for foreign trade entering Egypt. Every ship arriving from Greece or the Mediterranean had to stop there first. Cargo inspected, taxes collected, probably some paperwork done by very serious-looking officials. So the city functioned as both a religious center and a commercial gateway. Temples stood beside warehouses. Priests lived alongside merchants. And somewhere in the middle of all that, people lived ordinary lives. Fishermen, dock workers, boat builders, market vendors selling bread or dried fish, kids running around the canals, dogs stealing scraps from the docks. Because even in grand ancient port cities, daily life still looked surprisingly familiar. Another temple discovered underwater was dedicated to Osiris. Osiris, of course, was one of the central figures in Egyptian mythology. God of resurrection. Ruler of the afterlife. A very serious deity with very serious responsibilities. And Thonis-Heracleion hosted important annual religious ceremonies connected to him. During these ceremonies, priests would transport a sacred boat carrying the statue of Osiris through nearby waterways. Processions moved along canals. Music played. Offerings were made. Crowds gathered to watch. Which must have been quite a sight. A sacred barge gliding slowly across the water. Torches reflecting on the surface. Priests chanting quietly. Meanwhile, somewhere nearby, merchants were still negotiating grain prices. Because religion and business have always been very comfortable neighbors. One of the remarkable things about the underwater ruins is how intact the layout still appears. Archaeologists have mapped canals, docks, and building foundations across the site. It reveals a complex network of waterways. Thonis-Heracleion wasn't just near water. It was practically built within it. Which again, lovely atmosphere. But maybe not the most stable real estate investment in the long run. The city probably experienced flooding even before its final collapse. The Nile Delta is constantly shifting. River channels change. Sediment builds up. Storm surges from the Mediterranean occasionally push inland. Over centuries, these forces slowly reshaped the landscape. And Thonis-Heracleion eventually lost that geological tug-of-war. But for archaeologists today, that collapse turned into an incredible opportunity. Because underwater sites are often preserved far better than land ones. No later construction. No medieval towns built on top. No modern cities disturbing the ruins. Just layers of sand quietly protecting everything below. And every year, divers continue uncovering more artifacts. Coins, jewelry, ceramic vessels, statues of gods and priests, even small everyday objects like oil lamps. each item offering another tiny glimpse into the life of the city. And perhaps the most surreal part is that when archaeologists raise these statues and artifacts from the seabed, they often look almost untouched. After more than 1,000 years underwater, the stone's still smooth, the carvings still clear. It's like the city simply paused, pressed the world's slowest pause button, and waited patiently for someone to notice, which finally happened around the year 2000, after more than a millennium of silence. And in the next part, we'll float gently through the daily life of the people who once lived there. The merchants, the priests, the sailors arriving from across the Mediterranean, all the ordinary humans who walked the streets of Thonis-Heracleion long before the sea quietly claimed it. Part 3. Merchants, Priests, and the Gentle Chaos of an Ancient Port. Alright, let's settle in again. Maybe the room is quiet now. Maybe the lights are low. Maybe your phone is resting somewhere comfortable beside you. And we're drifting back down toward the calm, sandy seabed where the ruins of Thonis-Heracleion still lie quietly. Because tonight we're not focusing on statues or shipwrecks. Instead, we're going to wander slowly through the everyday life of the people who once lived there. No kings shouting orders. No dramatic battles. Just the steady, slightly messy rhythm of a busy port city in ancient Egypt. And if you've ever been near a harbor, you know ports are never completely calm. Even in ancient times. Ships creak against wooden docks. Waves slap gently against stone. Sailors shout instructions. Merchants argue politely, and then less politely about cargo prices. Somewhere a donkey is making deeply questionable life choices. And in Thonis-Heracleion, all of that activity happened at the very edge of the Nile Delta, because this city was the first stop for many foreign traders entering Egypt. If you sailed from Greece or the Eastern Mediterranean and wanted to sell goods in Egypt, this was where your journey paused. Your ship would approach the harbor slowly. Large river channels spread across the delta like veins. Reeds swayed along the shoreline. Flat wetlands stretched toward the horizon. And rising above the waterways, temples and buildings appeared. Stone walls, tall columns, massive statues, standing watch near the docks, which was probably a very effective reminder that Egypt was both wealthy and extremely serious about religion. Your ship would anchor. Officials would board. Cargo lists inspected. Taxes calculated. Because no matter what era you live in, customs authorities have always existed. They are one of history's most consistent institutions. Inside the city itself, the streets and canals formed a strange but practical network. Some neighborhoods were connected by narrow waterways rather than roads. Boats moved through the city like floating carts. Small wooden vessels carried sacks of grain. Others delivered amphorae of wine. Fishermen drifted quietly through canals with their nets, which must have created a slightly peaceful atmosphere in certain areas. Except, of course, when someone crashed their boat into a dock, which absolutely happened. Humans have been bad at parking things since the invention of vehicles. Markets filled many parts of the city. Open-air stalls selling food. Clay jars stacked beside piles of dried fish. Bread baked fresh in small ovens. Dates and figs arranged neatly on wooden tables. The smell must have been interesting. A mixture of river water, fish, incense from nearby temples, and baked bread. Not unpleasant, but definitely memorable. Merchants from foreign lands brought their own goods. Greek traders sold wine and olive oil. Phoenician merchants arrived with fine textiles and dyes from Phoenicia. Cypriot ships carried copper and pottery from Cyprus. And Egyptian merchants traded grain from the fertile Nile fields. Papyrus scrolls, jewelry, gold artifacts. Because Egypt had resources that much of the Mediterranean wanted. Very badly. So business in Thonis-Heracleion stayed busy almost all year. Ships arrived. Ships departed. Contracts negotiated. Taxes collected. And through it all, towering above the commercial noise, stood the temples. Religion was not a quiet background detail in Egyptian cities. It was everywhere. And the largest temple complex in Thonis-Heracleion honored the god Ammonius, the same powerful deity worshipped at places like Karnak Temple far upriver. Priests in white linen robes moved slowly through the temple courtyards. Incense burned continuously. Sacred rituals were performed daily. Offerings placed before statues of the gods. And unlike the loud chaos of the harbor, temples had a different rhythm. Calm. Measured. Almost quiet. Visitors stepped carefully through tall stone gateways. The columns rose high above them. Carvings covered the walls. Scenes of gods, pharaohs, and rituals repeating across the stone. The priests themselves held enormous authority. They maintained the temples, managed sacred property, oversaw religious festivals, and occasionally supervised important ceremonies involving the Nile itself. One particularly important ritual involved the god Osiris. Osiris, as you may remember, was deeply connected to ideas of rebirth and the cycle of life. So each year, festivals honoring Osiris included elaborate boat processions. Yes, sacred boat parades, which sounds surprisingly relaxing. Priests would carry a statue of Osiris onto a ceremonial barge, decorated with banners and flowers. The boat would then travel through the waterways near the city, crowds gathering along the banks, music playing, chants echoing softly across the water. The whole scene probably looked beautiful, a glowing procession drifting slowly through the canals at sunset. Very peaceful, very ceremonial. And just a short distance away, sailors were still unloading cargo and yelling about ropes. Because ancient cities loved combining sacred rituals with extremely practical commerce. And honestly, that combination probably made life feel balanced. People prayed. People traded. People argued about prices. People went home and complained about taxes. Some things never change. Foreign visitors must have found Thonis-Heracleion fascinating. The city was a cultural meeting point. Egyptian traditions mixing with Greek customs. Different languages spoken in the markets. Different clothing styles. Different foods. Greek sailors drinking wine in dockside taverns. Egyptian workers eating bread and vegetables nearby. Occasional misunderstandings about translation, which probably led to some wonderfully confusing conversations. Did he say 20 jars or 12 jars? I'm fairly sure he said 20. I'm fairly sure he meant 12. Well, we are now arguing about 8 jars. Trade negotiations in the ancient world were flexible. Meanwhile, life for ordinary workers continued steadily. Dock laborers loading cargo. Boat builders repairing hulls. Fishermen heading out early each morning into the delta waters. Farmers arriving from inland villages to sell crops. Children helping families at market stalls. And priests carefully maintaining temple rituals that had been performed for centuries. It was not glamorous life for most people, but it was stable, predictable, the kind of routine that builds over generations, which is why cities like Thonis-Heracleion could exist for hundreds of years. They weren't just ports. They were communities. Families growing up beside the canals. Neighbors greeting each other in the markets. Because when you live in a delta, water is always part of life. But eventually the changes became harder to ignore. Earth tremors shook the region occasionally. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to disturb the unstable soil. And once the ground beneath parts of the city began collapsing, the process became difficult to stop. Sections of land sank. Canals widened. Buildings tilted and fell. Harbors shifted. Some neighborhoods flooded permanently. And gradually, generation by generation, people moved away. Trade routes changed. Other ports grew more important, especially nearby Alexandria, which had become a massive center of commerce after its founding by Alexander the Great. Compared to that booming new city, Thonis-Heracleion slowly faded, until finally the sea reclaimed it entirely. The temples, the docks, the markets, the homes, all sliding quietly beneath the Mediterranean waves. No dramatic ending, just a slow disappearance. And for more than 1,000 years, the city slept beneath layers of sand and water, waiting patiently for divers and archaeologists to rediscover it, which, as we'll see in the next part, turned out to be one of the most fascinating underwater discoveries of the modern age. Because when Thonis-Heracleion reappeared, it brought an entire forgotten world with it. Part 4. When the sea gave the city back. Alright, let's drift gently back to the present. Or, at least, the early 2000s. Because for more than 1,000 years, the ruins of Thonis-Heracleion rested quietly under the Mediterranean Sea. Fish swam lazily between fallen columns. Sand slowly covered statues. Occasional storms shifted the seabed slightly, and then everything settled again. The city was effectively erased from the visible world. And for centuries, historians weren't completely sure what had happened to it. Ancient writers like Herodotus had described the port of Heracleion, but later travelers could not find it. No ruins, no standing temples, nothing, which made the city feel slightly mythical, like one of those places that appears in ancient texts but never shows up on maps. And historians understandably like maps. They prefer cities that stay where they're supposed to be. But nature, unfortunately, is not always cooperative. Then, around the late 1990s and early 2000s, underwater archaeological surveys began along the coast near Alexandria. The work was led by the French archaeologist Frank Gaudio and his team from the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology. Now, underwater archaeology is slow, very slow. Imagine doing normal archaeological excavation, but while floating, and wearing scuba equipment, and carefully brushing sand away from objects that have been sitting underwater for over 1,000 years. So patience is essential. Fortunately, archaeologists tend to have a lot of patience. They also used advanced technology. Side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profilers, magnetometers, all sorts of equipment designed to detect objects buried beneath the seabed, which sounds very high-tech, and it is. But the process still involves an enormous amount of careful diving and mapping, day after day, grid by grid, scanning the seafloor, until eventually something interesting appears. And in this case, something very interesting appeared. Large shapes beneath the sand, stone blocks, structural outlines, then statues, huge statues. Divers began uncovering massive carved figures, temple remains, ancient anchors, fragments of buildings. And it slowly became clear that they were standing inside the ruins of a large ancient city. Not a small fishing village, a real port, with temples, harbors, canals, and countless artifacts. And gradually, piece by piece, the puzzle came together. This was the lost city described by ancient sources. The port that had once controlled trade entering Egypt. The place Greeks called Heracleion. The place Egyptians called Thonis, now reunited again as Thonis-Heracleion, which must have been an incredibly satisfying moment for historians, because discovering a lost city is basically the archaeological equivalent of finding a missing chapter of history, except the chapter weighs several thousand tons and is covered in seaweed. Once the identification was confirmed, excavation began in earnest. Divers carefully lifted statues from the seabed using large, inflatable lifting bags, slowly raising them toward the surface, which must have looked slightly surreal. Imagine a 5-meter statue of the god Happy rising slowly through the water like some ancient stone submarine, covered in barnacles, fish swimming around it. The first time one of those statues broke the surface must have been unforgettable, because it meant a piece of the ancient world had returned after more than a millennium. Many of the statues were remarkably well preserved. Granite and limestone hold up surprisingly well underwater, especially when buried in protective sediment. Once cleaned and restored, the carvings became clear again. Facial features, headdresses, hieroglyphic inscriptions, details that had last been seen by human eyes over 1,000 years earlier. And the discoveries kept coming. Temples dedicated to Ammonius, ceremonial objects used by priests, coins from various Mediterranean regions, jewelry, pottery, even wooden objects preserved under the mud. One of the most fascinating aspects of the excavation was the number of ships discovered in the harbor. More than 60 ancient vessels have been identified so far. Some were small local boats. Others were larger cargo ships designed for long-distance Mediterranean trade. Their construction reveals fascinating details about ancient shipbuilding techniques. Wooden planks joined together with mortise and tenon joints, ropes and wooden pegs securing structural pieces, hull shapes designed to handle both river navigation and open sea travel. Some ships even carried cargo when they sank. Amphories still stacked in place, stone anchors nearby. It's like the moment of history paused. A merchant ship waiting at dock. A sudden collapse of harbor structures. The ship settling into the mud. And then silence. For over 1,000 years. Another remarkable discovery was the Nectanebo stele, issued by the pharaoh Nectanebo I. The inscription confirmed something historians had suspected. Foreign goods entering Egypt were taxed at this port. The decree described a 10% tax on trade, which must have made merchants sigh heavily, even in 380 BC. Some economic realities never change. Taxes remain stubbornly consistent throughout human history. Still, the system clearly worked, because Thonis-Heracleion became extremely wealthy. Religious institutions grew powerful. Temples expanded. Statues multiplied. Trade continued flowing, until the geological foundations beneath the city simply gave up. But thanks to modern archaeology, the city is no longer forgotten. Today, many of the recovered artifacts are displayed in museums. Visitors can see the colossal statues that once stood along temple entrances, stone inscriptions that recorded ancient laws, religious objects carried in sacred ceremonies, each one a quiet witness to a city that thrived thousands of years ago. And beneath the Mediterranean, much of the city still remains. Archaeologists estimate that only a portion of the site has been fully explored. Large sections remain buried under sediment, which means Thonis-Heracleion still has more secrets waiting patiently below the sand. And honestly, the city seems perfectly content about that. After all, it has already waited more than 1,000 years. A few more decades probably feel like a short nap. So, if you imagine the seabed tonight, the ruins are still there. Temple columns lying gently in the sand. Statues resting where they fell. Shipwrecks quietly preserved in the mud. Fish drifting through ancient courtyards. The city that once welcomed merchants from across the Mediterranean, now one of the most peaceful archaeological sites on Earth. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is this. Part 5. The long, quiet afterlife of a forgotten port. Alright, let's keep drifting. By now, the city of Thonis-Heracleion has been rediscovered, mapped, and slowly studied by archaeologists. But tonight we're going to slow things down even more. Because the strange thing about lost cities is that once they're found, they don't suddenly become loud again. They stay quiet. Underwater ruins don't turn into busy tourist streets. They remain calm places where divers move slowly, brushing sand away from objects that haven't been touched for centuries. And in many ways, that quiet pace suits Thonis-Heracleion perfectly. After all, this city spent more than 1,000 years resting beneath the Mediterranean near Alexandria. It's earned a relaxed retirement. Modern underwater archaeology at the site happens carefully, piece by piece. Divers descend along guide ropes. Visibility can be slightly murky. The Nile Delta carries fine sediment, which means the water sometimes looks a little cloudy. So archaeologists work slowly. A gentle brush, a careful measurement, a photograph, another brush. It's not the dramatic treasure hunting adventure movies love to show. There are no dramatic chests of gold bursting open. Mostly there's sand, lots of sand, and archaeologists quietly whispering things like, "Ah, I believe this might be a pottery fragment," which, to be fair, is still pretty exciting if you're an archaeologist, because every fragment adds a tiny piece to the puzzle of how the city once functioned. One of the interesting things researchers discovered is how well organized the harbor system was. The waterways around Thonis-Heracleion formed a carefully structured port. Large ships anchored in deeper channels. Smaller boats carried goods through canals into the city. Docks lined the waterways. Warehouses stood nearby. So the harbor operated almost like a giant floating logistics center. Cargo moved step by step through the system, which must have required quite a bit of coordination, and probably a fair amount of shouting. Dockworkers across history have never been known for whispering politely. The city also contained multiple temple complexes, not just one. The largest sanctuary honored the god Ammonius, but other deities were worshipped as well. Statues of Osiris have been found at the site, as well as artifacts connected to rituals honoring the Nile. Religion in ancient Egypt wasn't confined to one building. It spread across the entire city. Temples, shrines, sacred statues, priests overseeing ceremonies that had been repeated for generations. And now, underwater, many of those statues still remain exactly where they fell when the city collapsed, which creates a strangely peaceful scene. A giant stone god lying sideways in the sand. Fish drifting slowly past. Sunlight filtering through the water above. If ancient Egyptians could see it today, they might find it a little surprising. Or possibly just shrug and say something philosophical about the eternal cycle of life. Egyptian religion was quite comfortable with the idea that things change. Civilizations rise. Civilizations fall. The Nile floods. The Nile recedes. Life continues. So perhaps Thonis-Heracleion's underwater afterlife isn't entirely out of character. In fact, if you think about it, the city never completely disappeared. It simply moved from one chapter of history to another. First, it was a living port city. Then it became a legend mentioned by ancient writers like Herodotus. Then it became an archaeological mystery. And now it's one of the most fascinating underwater sites on Earth, which is quite an impressive career path for a city. Not many places get to reinvent themselves across 3,000 years. And archaeologists are still learning from it. For example, the ships discovered at the site reveal important details about ancient Mediterranean trade. Some vessels were built using Egyptian shipbuilding techniques. Others reflect influences from Greece and the wider Mediterranean, which confirms what historians long suspected. This port wasn't isolated. It was deeply connected to the international trade networks of the ancient world. Goods moved constantly between Egypt and neighboring regions. Wine from Greece, copper from Cyprus, luxury goods from Phoenicia, and grain from Egypt flowing outward to feed distant cities. Because Egyptian grain production was enormous. When the Nile flooded successfully, harvests could be massive, which made Egypt one of the Mediterranean's most important suppliers of food. Ports like Thonis-Heracleion helped move that grain across the sea. So even though the city itself eventually sank, its economic role shaped the region for centuries. Trade routes developed. Cultural exchanges happened. Ideas moved alongside goods. All because ships kept arriving at this delta harbor. And that influence continued long after the city vanished. In fact, nearby Alexandria eventually replaced it as the dominant port of Egypt. Alexandria grew into one of the largest cities in the ancient world, home to the famous Library of Alexandria and the legendary Lighthouse of Alexandria. But long before Alexandria rose to power, Thonis-Heracleion was already managing the flow of ships entering Egypt. It laid the groundwork for centuries of Mediterranean trade. So even though the city is now underwater, its legacy remains woven into the economic history of the region. And underwater archaeology continues revealing new details. Every excavation season brings fresh discoveries. Another statue uncovered. Another ship mapped. Another piece of ancient pottery carefully raised to the surface. Each object quietly telling its story. And perhaps the most comforting thought about Thonis-Heracleion is this. It didn't vanish in violence. No invading army burned it. No catastrophic war destroyed it. The city simply sank. Slowly. Gradually. Almost peacefully. Which makes its story feel strangely calm compared to many other lost cities in history. No dramatic final battle. Just nature doing what nature does. Shifting the land, moving the water, rewriting the coastline, and the city quietly accepting its new role beneath the sea. So, tonight, if you imagine the Mediterranean waters north of Egypt, the ruins are still there. Columns resting gently in the sand. Temple blocks scattered across the seabed. Statues lying where they fell centuries ago. A harbor that once welcomed ships from across the ancient world, now one of the calmest archaeological sites on the planet. No merchants arguing over cargo. No dock workers shouting instructions. Just the slow movement of water. And the quiet memory of a city that once stood at the gateway of the Nile, sleeping peacefully beneath the waves. Part 6. A city that waited patiently. All right. Let's ease into the final stretch of tonight's slow historical wander. By now, the city of Thonis-Heracleion has revealed a great deal about itself. Statues have been raised from the seabed. Ships have been mapped in careful detail. Temple walls and harbor structures have slowly reappeared from beneath layers of sediment. But even after decades of exploration, archaeologists believe large portions of the city are still buried, which means, technically speaking, Thonis-Heracleion is still keeping secrets, and it seems perfectly relaxed about that. Underwater cities don't rush. They sit quietly. Sand drifts over them. Currents shift the seabed slightly each year. And every now and then, a diver brushes away a little more sediment and finds something unexpected. A coin. A small statue. A fragment of carved stone. Sometimes the discoveries are enormous, like the giant statues that once stood at temple entrances. Other times they're tiny, everyday objects. Oil lamps. Pieces of jewelry. Simple ceramic bowls. Things that once belonged to ordinary people living their lives in this port city centuries ago. And in a strange way, those smaller objects may be the most interesting. Because statues and temples tell us about kings and gods. But pottery tells us about dinner. And dinner, as it turns out, has always been a very important part of human history. Imagine an evening in Thonis-Heracleion around 400 BC. The sun setting across the Nile Delta. Warm light reflecting off the canals. Merchants finishing their business for the day. Boats tied to wooden docks. Somewhere in the markets, bread is still being baked. The smell drifting gently through narrow streets. Families gathering for simple meals. Bread. Vegetables. Fish from the Delta. Maybe a little wine if the household could afford it. Not glamorous food, but reliable, which is exactly what people want after a long day of work. Meanwhile, priests continue their quiet routines inside temple courtyards. Incense smoke rising slowly toward the sky. Statues of the gods watching silently from their stone platforms. Among them the powerful figure of Ammonius, whose worship spread across much of Egypt. The temples would have glowed softly in torchlight at night. Large columns casting long shadows. The kind of calm environment where priests walked slowly and spoke quietly. A very different atmosphere from the busy harbor outside. And yet both worlds existed side by side. Commerce and religion. Cargo ships and sacred rituals. Dockworkers and priests. The everyday rhythm of a functioning ancient city. Visitors arriving from far away probably found the place fascinating. Greek merchants from Greece docking their ships. Phoenician traders from Phoenicia bargaining in the markets. Egyptian officials carefully recording cargo shipments. And all of it happening in a landscape shaped by water. The Nile Delta is never still. Channels shift. Sediment moves. The coastline slowly changes. Which means cities built there are always negotiating with nature. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not quite. And eventually, Thonis-Heracleion lost that negotiation. But its disappearance wasn't a dramatic collapse that people would write epic poems about. No thunderous destruction. No legendary final battle. Just gradual sinking. Buildings weakening. Harbors flooding. Residents quietly relocating to more stable ground. Perhaps toward growing cities like Alexandria, which became the dominant Mediterranean port after it was founded by Alexander the Great. Over time, trade routes shifted there. Merchants followed opportunity, and Thonis-Heracleion faded into memory, until eventually, even memory forgot it, except for a few scattered references in ancient writings. Writers like Herodotus mentioning the port of Heracleion. Historians reading those passages centuries later and wondering, was that city real? Or just another exaggerated story from antiquity? For a long time, the answer remained uncertain. But the Mediterranean had simply been hiding the evidence. And when underwater archaeologists finally found the ruins in 2000, led by Frank Gaudio, it confirmed that the ancient texts had been telling the truth. The city existed, it thrived, and it sank, which is a surprisingly peaceful ending for an ancient metropolis. No conquest, no catastrophic war, just the slow reshaping of land and water, nature adjusting the map slightly, cities disappearing, new cities rising nearby, history continuing its quiet cycle. And today, if you were to dive beneath the Mediterranean north of Egypt, you would find something extraordinary. A harbor floor scattered with stone blocks, temple statues resting on their sides, shipwrecks preserved in thick delta mud, all lying beneath about 10 meters of water. Not deep, just deep enough to keep the city hidden for over 1,000 years. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about Thonis-Heracleion is that it still feels calm. Underwater ruins tend to have that effect. The ocean muffles everything. Sound travels differently. Movements become slower. Divers glide gently through spaces that once held crowds of merchants and priests. The chaos of ancient city life replaced by quiet currents. Fish drifting through broken temple columns. Sunlight dancing across carved stone faces that haven't seen daylight in centuries. It's almost like the city decided it had worked long enough. handled enough trade ships, collected enough taxes, hosted enough religious ceremonies, and eventually said, in the most relaxed way possible, "You know what? I think I'll rest for a while." And so it did, for 1,000 years, waiting patiently beneath the waves, until someone came looking again. And even now, much of it remains untouched. More statues waiting beneath the sand. More ships buried in the harbor mud. More quiet stories waiting for archaeologists to brush away another layer of sediment. But there's no rush. After all, Thonis-Heracleion has already proven it's very good at waiting. And somewhere beneath the Mediterranean tonight, the city continues its long, peaceful sleep. Part 7. Drifting away from a city that refused to stay lost. All right, let's ease into the final quiet moments of tonight's story. By now we've wandered through the ruins of Thonis-Heracleion, floated through its harbors, and imagined the slow rhythm of life in a port that once stood at the gateway of Egypt. We've watched statues rise again from the seabed, seen ships preserved in ancient mud, and followed archaeologists as they gently brushed history out of the sand. But as with most ancient places, the story of Thonis-Heracleion isn't really about one moment. It's about time. Long, quiet stretches of time. Cities are strange things. They feel permanent when people live in them. Stone walls, temples, markets, busy streets filled with voices. But history has a way of reminding us that even the largest cities are temporary arrangements between humans and the landscape. And the landscape usually wins. For centuries, Thonis-Heracleion was exactly where traders expected it to be. Ships arriving from Greece would see temple towers rising above the delta. Merchants unloading amphorae of wine. Officials calculating trade taxes. Priests moving slowly through temple courtyards dedicated to gods like Osiris. The harbor would have been filled with movement. Wooden hulls creaking, ropes tightening, dockworkers shouting instructions. But underneath all that activity, the ground itself was slowly shifting. The Nile Delta is not a stable place. It's a constantly changing landscape built from layers of mud carried by the river. Over centuries, those layers compress. Water moves through them. Earthquakes ripple through the region occasionally. And sometimes cities sink. Not dramatically, just gradually. Buildings tilt. Walls crack. Water creeps into streets. People relocate to safer areas. Trade moves elsewhere. Eventually, the sea finishes the job. And once the city slipped beneath the Mediterranean, it simply disappeared from daily life. Nearby ports took its place, especially Alexandria, which grew into one of the most powerful cities of the ancient Mediterranean. Alexandria became famous for wonders like the towering lighthouse of Alexandria and the legendary library of Alexandria. And while Alexandria grew louder and richer, Thonis-Heracleion slowly faded into silence beneath the waves. For more than 1,000 years, which is a very long time for a city to be missing. Long enough for stories to blur. Ancient writers like Herodotus had described the port called Heracleion. But historians later wondered if those descriptions were exaggerated. After all, Herodotus occasionally mentioned unusual things. Gold-digging ants, for example. So when a city he described couldn't be found, scholars weren't entirely shocked. Maybe it had never existed. Maybe it was confused with another port. Maybe it was just another slightly dramatic travel story from antiquity. But history sometimes hides things in unexpected places. And in this case, it hid an entire city beneath 10 meters of seawater, waiting quietly for modern technology to catch up. When underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio and his team began surveying the Egyptian coastline in the late 1990s, they weren't necessarily expecting to find a legendary lost city. They were studying ancient trade routes, mapping the seabed, scanning for buried structures. And then the sonar began showing shapes. Large shapes. Stone shapes. The kind that suggest walls, temples, statues. Which must have been one of those rare archaeological moments when curiosity slowly turns into excitement. Because when divers descended and started uncovering massive sculptures and temple remains, it became clear that something very important had been found. Not a small settlement, a major port, a city that had once controlled the flow of trade into Egypt. And suddenly the ancient texts made sense again. Heracleion was real. Thonis was real. They were simply two names for the same city, and the sea had preserved it remarkably well. Today, many of the statues recovered from the site stand in museums. Visitors can see the giant stone figures that once stood at temple gates. Colossal sculptures of Egyptian deities, including the Nile god Hapi, whose statue lay peacefully underwater for more than a millennium. Looking at those statues today is a little surreal, because the carvings are still clear, the stone still smooth. It's easy to imagine them standing upright again beside a harbor entrance, watching ships glide past, hearing the sounds of an ancient city at work. And yet the harbor itself now lies beneath quiet Mediterranean water. Columns resting sideways in the sand. Shipwrecks preserved in thick delta mud. Fish drifting through spaces where merchants once walked. Which makes Thonis-Heracleion one of the most peaceful archaeological sites in the world. No crowds. No traffic. Just divers moving slowly through the ruins. Carefully documenting a city that history almost forgot. And perhaps that quiet ending feels strangely appropriate, because Thonis-Heracleion was always connected to water. Its canals, its harbors, its sacred processions along the Nile Delta. The city lived beside the water for centuries, and eventually it simply returned to it. Not destroyed, not burned, just absorbed back into the landscape that had always shaped it. So tonight, somewhere beneath the Mediterranean north of Egypt, the ruins still rest where they fell. Statues lying peacefully in the sand. Temple blocks scattered across the seabed. Ancient ships sleeping beneath layers of mud. A once busy harbor now quieter than almost any place on earth. And if the currents are gentle and the water clear, sunlight still filters down through the sea, touching the carved faces of gods that last saw daylight more than 1,000 years ago. A reminder that history doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it simply waits, patiently, under the water, until someone remembers to look. Part 8. One last quiet drift over the sunken city. Alright, before we gently fade out for the night, let's take one final slow drift over the ruins of Thonis-Heracleion. No rushing, no dramatic ending, just a calm glide through a place that once hummed with life. Imagine descending again through the Mediterranean water north of Egypt. The surface ripples quietly above. Sunlight breaks into long soft beams as it filters downward. The water grows cooler, calmer, quieter. And then, slowly, shapes begin to appear below. At first it looks like scattered rocks. But as the sand clears, the outlines become clearer. Stone blocks, temple walls, fragments of columns, pieces of a city that once stood proudly at the mouth of the Nile Delta. You glide past a fallen statue, a massive granite figure lying gently on its side. One of the many sculptures that once guarded temple entrances. Its carved face still calm. Its features still sharp despite more than 1,000 years underwater. Nearby rests another enormous statue, the Nile god Hapi, whose round belly symbolized abundance and fertility. In ancient times, he represented the life-giving floods of the Nile, the yearly rising water that made Egyptian agriculture possible. Without that flood, Egypt would have struggled to feed its people. With it, the civilization flourished. So statues of Happy once stood proudly in places like this harbor, watching ships arrive from across the Mediterranean. And now one of those statues lies peacefully beneath the sea, which feels oddly poetic. A river god resting underwater. Not the worst retirement plan if you think about it. As you drift further along the seabed, the remains of ancient ships appear. Wooden hulls partially buried in thick delta mud. Some still shaped clearly enough that you can imagine them floating again. Cargo vessels that once carried wine from Greece, copper from Cyprus, textiles and dyes from Phoenicia. Trade that flowed constantly through this port centuries ago. Now the ships lie still, ropes long gone, sails vanished, but their shapes preserved by layers of sediment. Tiny fish drift through gaps in the wooden planks. Sea plants grow quietly around the wrecks. The harbor that once rang with voices is now silent except for the slow movement of water. Further along, the remains of a temple emerge. Massive stone blocks arranged in collapsed patterns. Columns lying sideways like fallen trees. This was once part of the great sanctuary dedicated to Ammonius, a place where priests once performed daily rituals, burning incense, reciting prayers, offering food and gifts to the gods. The temple would have been filled with soft chanting and the smell of sacred oils, torches flickering against carved walls. Now the same walls lie beneath shifting sand, but the carvings remain. Hieroglyphs still etched into the stone. Images of gods and pharaohs frozen in ancient poses. History preserved not by careful storage, but by accident, by water,
and by time.
If you glide slowly through the ruins, you might notice something else. The layout of canals. Channels that once carried boats through the city. Thonis-Heracleion wasn't just near water. It was built within a network of waterways. Small vessels would have moved through these canals every day, delivering grain, transporting goods, carrying passengers across the port. A floating transportation system thousands of years before modern cities started building canal networks again, which shows that ancient engineers were often more creative than we give them credit for. People tend to imagine the ancient world as slow and primitive, but places like Thonis-Heracleion were sophisticated trade hubs, complex urban centers managing international commerce, all without electricity, or engines, or spreadsheets. Just boats, ropes, writing tablets, and a lot of patient bookkeeping. Speaking of writing, one of the most important discoveries from the city was a stone decree issued by Nectanebo I. The inscription described trade taxes applied to foreign ships entering Egypt, a 10% tax, which means that somewhere in this harbor long ago, merchants sighed dramatically while handing over part of their profits. Some traditions truly never change. Taxes have been disappointing traders for thousands of years. But the system worked. Trade flowed.
Goods moved.
The city prospered, until the natural instability of the Nile Delta eventually brought everything to a quiet stop. Buildings sank. Harbors flooded. Residents moved to safer cities like Alexandria. And the sea slowly claimed the abandoned port. Over time, sediment covered the ruins. Fish moved in. Currents reshaped the seabed. And Thonis-Heracleion became one of the many lost cities whispered about in ancient texts. Writers like Herodotus had mentioned the port of Heracleion centuries earlier. But for a very long time, historians weren't sure if it had truly existed. Until underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio and his team rediscovered the ruins in 2000. And suddenly the ancient stories were no longer mysterious legends. They were maps, guides pointing to a real city resting beneath the sea. And now, even after years of excavation, large parts of the site remain unexplored. More statues still buried. More ships hidden beneath sediment. More pieces of everyday life waiting quietly under the sand. But that feels appropriate somehow. A city that slept for 1,000 years probably doesn't mind waiting a little longer. So, as we slowly drift away tonight, imagine the ruins settling back into their calm silence. Temple columns resting where they fell. Stone statues watching the water currents pass. Ancient ships sleeping beneath the harbor mud. The once busy gateway to the Nile now quieter than almost anywhere on Earth. And far above on the surface of the Mediterranean, waves move gently across the water. Most people sailing there have no idea that a vast ancient city lies just beneath them. A city that welcomed traders from across the ancient world. A city that slowly slipped beneath the sea. A city that waited patiently for history to find it again. And now that it has been found, it continues resting peacefully, just as it has for centuries, beneath the calm Mediterranean waves. Part 10. The Quiet Legacy of a Lost City. Alright, let's drift slowly toward the very end of our journey over Thonis-Heracleion. By now, the city has revealed much of itself. Its temples, statues, canals, and sunken ships all tell fragments of the story. But the real wonder is how it continues to exist in a form untouched by the chaos of human life. Modern visitors, archaeologists, diverse, curious souls, approach the site carefully. They move like whispers through a place that has already seen thousands of years of history. Every brush of sand reveals a tiny window into daily life. Every unearthed statue or amphora reminds us that this was once a bustling city filled with people, ordinary and extraordinary alike. And yet, the city doesn't demand attention. It doesn't try to impress. It simply exists. A quiet record of human ingenuity, devotion, and routine. A reminder that civilizations are delicate. That even the busiest, most prosperous ports eventually return to nature. Thonis-Heracleion teaches us patience. The kind that comes from observing centuries slip slowly by. It shows us that not all endings are dramatic. Sometimes the most profound stories unfold in silence, beneath layers of sediment, beneath waves that have outlasted kings, priests, and merchants alike. Its legacy continues in subtle ways. Through the artifacts preserved in museums. Through the research that slowly reconstructs daily life in a Nile Delta port. Through the inspiration it provides for understanding ancient trade, religion, and urban planning. And perhaps the most comforting thought is this: the city still rests peacefully, still waiting, still drifting, still offering itself slowly, quietly, to those willing to look, to learn, and to imagine life in a time long before our own. So, as we finish tonight's journey, let's leave the city where it belongs. Beneath the calm Mediterranean waves. A city that rose, flourished, sank, and waited patiently. A city that, in its quiet way, reminds us that history doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And when we listen, we can hear it perfectly. Good night, Thonis-Heracleion. We'll leave you to your slow, eternal drift beneath the waves.